So fortunately, there's some good labs on big data on GCP that are available here, and they have this thing called data-proc, and with data-proc, it can handle a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And so the one that I think is an interesting one is there's a data-proc command line job here. Let's see. Let me look for command line. Here we go. Provisioning using a managed Hadoop Spark cluster with data-proc. And anybody that has access to the Quick Labs can run this. And so the idea here is just to get familiar with running the cloud data-proc. And so what I'm going to do here is just spin this thing up, submit a job to a Spark cluster, resize it, and then SSH into the cluster, and then just kind of examine it. So this is more like a just hello world type, get started with Spark example. So I'm gonna launch this thing, and now what I'll need to do is log into the GCP shell using these credentials. So I'm gonna just copy that, and I'm gonna open up the console, and we'll go here. And copy this password here. Accept this. So I guess the first thing that we'll do is activate this Cloud Shell. And again, what's interesting about the this Cloud Shell environment or this terminal, you can see that a lot of powerful things in the GCP cloud involve this terminal. And I think it's one of the best features of really the GCP infrastructure is that they give you the shell that you can use to kind of mess around with things. And so the first thing that we'll do here is just get the list of the account. So I'm gonna run this in, and I'm cutting and pasting from the lab that I have in another screen. And you can see here that it shows me what my account is, right? So I know that I'm set here. And then the other thing that we'll do is just make sure that the project itself, we're able to list what it is. Great. And then the next step is that I'm going to create a new cluster. And so in order to do that, I believe I have to set a variable here. Yeah, so what I need to do is create a shell variable. So a lot of times with big data systems, you need to know a little bit of shell. Let's see here, we've got another question. Oh, the lab. So the lab that I'm going to be using here is going to be, I can open this up and put this into chat here as well. Let's go to here, put this in. That's the lab I'm working on. If you just check it, Slack here. So what's interesting about any of these big data systems is that you're going to have to work with the shell a lot. And that's just the nature of working with a big data system. And so one of the things that's a shell-based operation to be aware of, let me just close this. This is kind of irritating. I think I can escape and make this thing go away on the left. There we go. So if I go through here and I put cluster name is equal to DB lab, your name, and I'll just put in UNCC NOAA or something like that, that I'm setting a shell variable. And how do I know that the variable is set? What I can do is I can type in echo $ cluster name like that, and then it'll paste up it'll paste up a lab, or I'm sorry, paste up a shell variable. And so shell variables with large scale systems just are always going to be around. It's something to be aware of when you're working with large scale systems. And so in this example here, what I'm going to do is now create a cluster. So I'll copy this command here, and again I'll paste it in. Actually, wrong command. Let me paste the right command in here. Copy this, paste it in. There we go. And so you can see the command that Google has to spawn a cluster, and I'll maybe make it a little bit bigger, is data-proc command, create a cluster, and then use that shell variable that I created up here. And then there's a couple other things to be aware of, which is you say the scopes, the tags, the zone. So this is the location. And then also what is the worker and what's the master. And these clustered systems always have a master and then workers, worker nodes associated with them. And we'll see this when we get into the EMR stuff on AWS later. So I believe this may or may not work though. Let me see if I run this. Yeah, so one of the things that you have to do that the lab misses is, look, they didn't provide the region code flag for you. So if I go to the up arrow, that'll bring back the command that I just ran. And all I have to do is, I think I can put this right here. I can just type in region and put in US Central 1 like that. And now if I return, the command will work. So if you were doing the same thing and you had a problem with it, that's why put in -- region, and then it should work in theory. Okay, and this will take just a second to spin all this up. I think it takes maybe like 3-4 minutes or something like that. And I guess we could also, while this is spinning up here, I could open up another tab, I guess, and I could look at, I believe, the data-proc, and I think there's like a monitoring that will show you the cluster itself. So here you can see the actual cluster. You can click on jobs, you can click on workflows, and all of these are things to look at if you're working. So with a Spark cluster in the real world, and in particular, let's say you have a permanent Spark cluster. Many companies have that. Like you're at a Fortune 500 company or something, they may have a permanent Spark cluster. Let's say you're running it on the Google Cloud Platform, you probably would go in here all the time, right? Because you'd want to look at just what's happening with your cluster. How many worker nodes do you have? And keep in mind here that the worker nodes, this shows you the scalability, right? In a distributed system, the more worker nodes you have, in theory, the more scale you would have up to a certain point where you get diminishing returns. And then in this case as well, we can see the status, right? We can see that this thing's provisioning. And I believe that's the most useful stuff you have in this thing, really. So if we go back to this, hopefully this spins up in just a couple minutes or so. Yeah, and this is really one of the things that, as I mentioned earlier, is interesting about working with big data systems. I've had experience working with big data systems, both Spark and also in film. And in film, it's interesting because they have this thing called a render farm. And in the render farm, you have a bunch of nodes as well. You have, in some cases, maybe 100,000 nodes. And it requires very specialized skills and very strange workflows to work with a bunch of machines at the same time. And so one of the things that is a requirement in working with a large scale system is that you have to be very patient because it takes a long time to spin everything up. So, okay, looks like we got this thing running here. So the next thing that we'll do is we'll run a job on our cluster. And if I go back here, you should see if I refresh this somewhere, where's the refresh? Here we go. This should say, look, it's operational, it's running. In fact, if I click on the cluster, I believe it will have more information as well. Like it'll tell you all kinds of, cool metrics about like Spark itself, which is pretty interesting. So in fact, the web interface is something you can enable as well. But let's go back to the shell, and I'm going to run a Spark job. So this would be, let's say someone hires you as a big data engineer, or a big data machine learning engineer. This is the stuff you probably would need to do. Is something very similar to this. Is you paste this in here, and here you can see what the command is. Again, we use the G-Cloud start of it. It has these options here: data-proc job, submit a Spark job, pick which cluster. In a very large company, let's say Netflix or some other company that runs Spark, you could have many clusters. Maybe you could have 100 clusters. So again, this is where the variable is important. And then what we'll do here is we will specify, in this case, a path to a Java executable. And in Java, they have executables that are binaries, so you can basically just give it some code that was written, and it will execute the code for you. Now, I believe we also, if I run this, it will not work as well because I didn't put region. So what I'll need to do is, I think right after the cluster, I also need to do the region flag here. So I'm going to go through here and say -- region equals, I forgot what I put last time. It was, let's see, I can look at the history. It was this. It was US Central 1. So I'm going to copy this, paste that in there. Yep, US Central 1, just like that. And if you do Control E, that gets you to the end of a line. If you do Control A, that gets you to the beginning of the line. So that can be really handy to know those shortcuts if you're bouncing around, making huge command line options. Here we go. Go ahead and run this. And now I've submitted a job to the cluster. And I believe I can both see it here, and I also could go to this cluster as well, and we should start to see this thing kind of, doing stuff. Here we go, CPU utilization, right? And depending on, I guess this is a little bit of a, there's a lag here in when this is actually reporting, but it does appear to be doing something, and we're still waiting for the job output. Now, I also think you could go back to this and you could look at the stack driver monitoring. And so this is something that Google has that has like a more detailed monitoring. I guess they don't enable it for this lab, but if you wanted to look at like more granular details, that's a place where you could dig into the monitoring at a higher level. Okay, so it finished. Now let's look at what it did. So when it finishes, it outputs a bunch of useful information. So it shows me what the name of the cluster was that I used, what was the actual job itself. So maybe I wanted to look at the job in the future again. It has a unique ID. It tells me the status of it. And then I believe it also should show you, yeah, here we go. We can see that pi is roughly 3.1416. Yeah, so basically it also shows the output of the operation. And if you want to look at what the command is that it ran, I think if I just go to this, I can find this if I just Google it. I think it's just you can look at the source code for this. And the source code, let's see if we can find the source code. Spark.example jar. Well, I can't find it off the top of my head, but basically it all does is calculate digits of pi. So that's really a high level, the gist of kind of the hello world aspects of things. Now, let's look at a couple other things you can do that could be useful. One of them would be to list the jobs that I've actually run. And this would be something that could be really, really useful, is to, if you have a cluster that you're responsible for, it's possible that you'd want to go connect to it and see who's running what jobs, because maybe somebody is overwhelming your cluster. And this is something that happens a lot, is that when you're dealing with a large resource like this, you have to decide who gets access to it and how do you control things, and like who, there's a lot of things that you don't normally think about that happen in a distributed system where multiple people are using it. And so one of the things that you will need to do often is just look into who's been running jobs and what they've actually been doing. Now, another thing we can do here, which is kind of neat in this lab, is we'll resize the cluster. So let's imagine, and this again is very normal, is that you want things to go faster, and so you basically add more resources to it. So how would you do that? In this case, first we describe it, and I'll also put this region variable here, or flag. So we describe it. You can see that it tells you a bunch of metrics about, that there's 2 instances, and so what we're going to do is we're going to add a preemptible node. And what a preemptible node is basically, it's like a spot instance on AWS. It's basically a node that you just want to temporarily expand it, but it's possible that node could be used by Google. They may take it away, and so you're paying much less for it because it's a preemptible node. So again, I have to add the flag here, and I guess I can be lazy and just copy it, which is right here, just like this. Add this. There we go. So we're gonna upgrade this cluster, and I believe that if we go back to the cluster details, look, we can see. Remember before it had 2. Now we're telling it that we added a third, right? So now there's a third worker node, and when this is done, there we go. We can see that it was able to actually update the worker node. And then I guess the final thing we can do is we can SSH into the cluster itself. And this is kind of neat that they give you a command here to SSH into the cluster. And from here, I could also pass in a region here like that. And let's see here. Oh, I need to put this. Let's see here. I think I need to put that maybe before this. Let's try that. Interesting how this is not working. Let's see. Okay, I guess I didn't need the region code or the region flag. So I'll say yes, we'll connect to it. And now I believe we're in the cluster. And so once you're in the cluster, you can just type in hostname. There we go. And we can, I guess we could also run like top or something like that. You could run a command that shows you, what's running on the system. So we see that Java is running, right? We know that the Spark ecosystem requires Java. So in theory, you could actually be running jobs on this and then monitoring the jobs and observing what's happening through when the jobs are running. So in a nutshell, that's really the gist of kind of some of the things you would do, more of a hello world Spark on the Google Cloud platform. So what I'll probably do is just stop that and then